Hello team, welcome to another ATP Geopolitics video with myself, Jonathan M.S. Pearce. This is a Ukraine war news update, the second part thereof for the 1st of October 2025. I've recorded this video already and the mic wasn't turned on and I could cry. So I'm going to do it again. Oh well, let's get into it. Right, we're going to start with a pretty interesting analysis from Anton Gerashchenko of hybrid warfare and the tactic of the Russians to try and recruit young people. Particularly, we've seen this in Ukraine with young teenagers recruited to set fire to things and whatnot. Different ways of attracting people who aren't necessarily ideologically for or against Ukraine or Russia, but just young people who you could, I guess, blackmail or tempt with money or whatever. Now, after the full-scale invasion of Ukraine, hundreds of Russian diplomats, many of whom engaged in intelligence and espionage activities, were expelled from EU countries. They used to have this thing where if you knew where diplomats were, you knew where the spies were, you're fine with that because you can monitor them. Then they made this decision after the start of the war to just actually get rid of, scare quotes, diplomats, Russian diplomats across Europe because they were seen as spies, and actually, no, let's just have a concerted effort to get rid of them. And that left Russia in a bit of a bind because actually they didn't have this expertise, they didn't have these people doing jobs that they wanted to do, and so they had to come up with other ways of achieving their goals. Right, deprived of its usual agent network, says Gerashchenko, Moscow began looking for unconventional ways to wage a hybrid war against Western nations. One such method has been the recruitment of teenagers and young people from Western countries. Security experts explain this approach simply: teenagers are vulnerable, i.e. blackmail, they need, as it says here, often in need of money and do not require major expenses from the special services. The methods of recruitment have been adapted to the younger generation. Russian special services establish contact with potential agents through messengers and video game chats, offering quick money rewards. Transfers are often made via cryptocurrencies, which makes it difficult to track financial flows. They are offered simple tasks to photograph a building, record the movement of equipment, and sometimes to set fire or carry out acts of sabotage. Here are some examples in a second. So the main goal is to sow chaos, create unrest among the population, and reduce the amount of aid going to Ukraine. So this is a Dutch example. At the end of September 2025, two 17-year-old teenagers were arrested in the Netherlands on suspicion of espionage. According to the investigation, they used a special device, a Wi-Fi sniffer, to scan networks and intercept wireless data near the headquarters of Europol, Eurojust, and the Canadian Embassy in The Hague. Britain. In March 2024 in London, 5 young people acting on orders from the Russian Wagner PMC set fire to a warehouse storing equipment for Starlink satellite internet, which belonged to a Ukrainian businessman. The entrepreneur was involved in supplying aid to Kyiv. The saboteurs were arrested. All of them were around 20 years old. This one concerns a 20-year-old Colombian, Ramos Santos, on orders from Russia, was preparing a terrorist attack in Lithuania against the UAB TVC Solutions company, involved in supplying drones to Ukraine. In the summer of 2025, he was arrested in his home country. And Canada, another example, is a case of 17-year-old Canadian Laken Paven. According to the investigation, in the spring of 2024, he was recruited by the FSB agent named Slon, or Elephant. Before that, the Canadian secretly travelled to Russian-occupied Donetsk and attempted to join the Inter-Brigades group to fight on the Russian side. But instead, he was given a different assignment: to travel around Europe and photograph objects of interest to Russia. When he turned 18, Paven was instructed to enlist in the Ukrainian army. Fortunately, the plan was never carried out. In May 2024, the young man himself went to the police in Warsaw and confessed to his ties with the FSB. A Polish court sentenced him to 20 months in prison for espionage, taking into account his age in cooperation with the investigation. According to Reuters, there have been a total of 12 known cases of teenagers being recruited to spy for Russia in Germany, Poland, the UK, and Lithuania. Countermeasures are in place. So German authorities have launched a campaign on Instagram and TikTok under the slogan "Don't become a disposable agent," which warns young people about the risks and urges them not to let themselves be bribed for a few €100. In the Netherlands, the law against state interference has been tightened since May 2025. Secret cooperation with a foreign power that harms national interests is now punishable by up to 8 years in prison. And in Lithuania, authorities have recommended that schools hold talks with students about the threat of recruitment recruitment, according to a survey by the Lithuanian School Student Union. And this is an incredible stat. 14% of respondents received suspicious offers to collect information about certain places, photographs of car plates, people, or buildings. 14% of young people surveyed have been approached to work on behalf of Russia. Wow, it's absolutely incredible. Anyway, interesting thread there from Gerashchenko. And we're going to move to Poland and the Nord Stream 2 pipeline. Poland detains a Ukrainian suspected of Nord Stream sabotage. Media reports a suspect identified as Volodymyr Zelensky. No, obviously not. Was apprehended in the town of Pruszków in central eastern Poland. He is wanted under a European arrest warrant issued by the German court in 2024. Now, this presents quite the problem, because if Ukraine are responsible for the destruction of Nord Stream, you have potentially, for some people, this divergence of morality and legality. I've talked about this a number of times with you. Morality isn't necessarily correlated with legality. You can look at that as an onlooker supportive of Ukraine and say, I can use some consequentialist ethics here to determine that what Ukraine did, assuming Ukraine did this, right? They blew up Nord Stream, and that's not definitely sure, but assuming that Ukraine blew up the Nord Stream 2 pipeline, then you think that's a good thing. That's going to stop money coming into Russia from Europe, and it forces Europe to get alternative sources for their gas, and that's a good thing. But it is still illegal. I mean, it's internationally illegal. That. So, like, what do you do with that? How do these countries feel about that? What does Germany do? What do these countries that would have used Nord Stream 2 pipeline, did they just sink it and just say, hey, do you know what? Not really going to complain. I understand why they did it. Sucks to be Ukraine. Up against it. They did that. It's illegal. Nah. Then, you might have financial entities within Europe who actually want to sue on account of that. They might be losing money as a result of Nord Stream blowing up. Now, if that had been Russia, then that's one of those things, and you can maybe try and get that back, or I don't know, they're the bad guys, and yeah. But if it's Ukraine, what happens there? There could be some serious tensions between allies here if Ukraine was indeed responsible for the Nord Stream 2 pipeline destruction. So I think that's one to watch. Fascinated to see how the international community will deal with that if indeed Ukrainians are found responsible for its destruction. It does also, by the way, cast people like Seymour Hersh, the journalist, into quite a bit of disrepute, I would say. So he came up with some great scoop whereby he had these sources in intelligence, and it was the Norwegian Navy together with the Americans that did this, blah, 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 blah. And that appears to be complete and utter bollocks. He said he had these sources, and as I showed in one of my videos, in fact, I wrote an article on this once, that you could tell by the phraseology used in the article from his supposedly American source that he didn't translate it. Well, he just used the Russian phrase. It's what was it? Something like a waif in her underwear, or something like that. Some kind of weird phrase, which is a Russian phrase. And you'd only understand that if you were reading it in Russian and understood the Russian context there. But he included that in his supposedly a source from America, an intelligence source that told him blah 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 blah, slagging off Zelensky and all this kind of stuff. And you're like, no, your source is Russian. And you've just just stuff like that is made me think that Seymour Hersh's account of what happened was absolute bunkum, and in fact it was debunked. And I did go through this earlier in the war, but having arrests of people like this does show that Seymour Hersh was indeed hugely wrong. And I remember having arguments with people who were defending Seymour Hersh's journalism and saying X, Y, and Z, as a result of this, some kind of left-wingers actually in my friendship group on Facebook who were more aligned to this is EU, NATO expansionism and blah, 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 more aligned to Russia not being so responsible for the war in Ukraine. And I was like, no. And then they'd look what Seymour Hersh has written. I was like, that is BS. But actually, interesting that it could well turn out to be who was probably least expected, which is the Ukrainians. Naftogaz, the Ukrainian gas entity, has signed a historic €300 million deal with European Investment Bank. According to Reuters, the money will be used to purchase gas to build long-term reserves. This will increase the reliability of gas supplies in the face of Russian attacks on civilian energy infrastructure. So that's good news. They're going to need that over the winter period. Russia is going to ramp up their attacks on energy, that's for sure. Raiffeisen Bank, you might remember me mentioning them a lot. They are an Austrian bank that is often on a list of, the blacklist or whatever it is, the sanctions list, and Austria then used that as a leverage to say, look, we're not going to sign up to these European sanctions unless you take Raiffeisen off the sanctions list. So they end up not being on the sanctions list, but Ukraine would, or Europe would like them on the sanctions list anyway. Raiffeisen Bank International has failed in another attempt to sell a stake in its Russian business. Two people familiar with the situation said, as Russia seeks to maintain a key financial bridge to the West. So, the Russians want this Austrian bank to still be an Austrian bank in Russia, operating in Russia, because it gives them an access to European financial markets. Raiffeisen's bank in Russia is the biggest lender in the country that is not subject to sanctions, which have isolated local rivals, making it of critical importance for trade payments with Russia, including gas exports to Europe. Moving on, today marks an important step on Ukraine's path to the EU, said Marta Kos actually the other day. In the most difficult of circumstances, Ukraine has completed the screening process of its entire legislation at record speed, laying the foundations for its European future. We now need to maintain momentum for reform. This is incredible. I mean, it is incredible that Ukraine has been able to jump through these hoops during war in order to get accession to the EU, that they have in record time ticked a load of boxes and had institutional reform to the point where Europe is largely happy with where they're at, and it's quite amazed that they've been able to do that in a war context. Now, speaking of which, Financial Times reports that despite Hungary's veto, Brussels plans to begin technical work on membership clusters for Ukraine and Moldova. The workaround lets integration prep continue even without formal talks. Leaders will debate the approach in Copenhagen this week. So the EU is moving to advance Ukraine's accession by sidestepping Hungary there. And we're going to now move to Moldova. So Zelensky spoke, as you can imagine, with the president of Moldova after the elections, Maya Sandu. I'm glad to congratulate Maya on a very important victory and wish her success. These elections showed that Russian destabilizing activity is losing, and Moldova in Europe is winning. Russian subversion, constant disinformation, none of it worked. It is important that Moldova was effective in protecting itself from these threats together with all those who helped. This is a great success, wasn't it? What happened is, on about just over 50% of the vote, they got over 50% of the seats. The reason why there's a slight discrepancy there is because if you are a block, you have to get, so a block of number of parties, you have to get over 7% of the votes to get seats. If you are an individual party, you have to get over 5% of the votes. And I think it was, if you are an independent, like an independent MP running in a certain area, you have to get over 2% of the vote to get a seat. So all those ones sort of underneath this 5% here, there were lots. It would have added up to a bunch of percentages, but they don't get seats. So those percentages are then like scaled up to all of these people, all of these entities. So the PAS of Maya Sandu, the Party of Action and Solidarity, get around about 50% of votes, 50.2%, and 55 out of 101 seats. Now, interestingly, they have gone down 8 from the landslide they had in 2021. 63, they're now down to 55. But considering people were thinking the pro-Russian parties were going to win this election, this is an absolutely magnificent victory for PAS. Now, the Patriotic Electoral Bloc, remember, with the hammer and sickle inside a heart, inside of a Soviet star, and that's how pro-Russian they are. They actually, I mean, look, PAS had a over 2-to-1 ratio of votes there. But actually, the Patriotic Electoral Bloc, the pro-Russians, lost 6 seats compared to where they were in 2021. So they are down to 26. Now, you can say that the 6 seats that they lost went to our party because they are a pro-Russian party there. So that's fair enough. Then you've got 8 seats for the alternative bloc. So this is a bloc of other parties that are apparently nominally pro-European. They took 8. Let's argue for make that point for the sake of argument. They took 8 seats from the Party of Action and Solidarity. Now, that's a slight worry because I said they're nominally European, but as someone in the comments was telling me from Moldova, they aren't really, and it looks like they could be just trying to get votes from the PAS and upset the apple cart. We'll have to see how that bloc turns out. And then the Democracy at Home Party, they've taken 6 probably from other parties that previously did have seats in the parliament, but now no longer do. And although I think they're nominally pro-EU or they're an anti-corruption party, I think they could be another one similar to Alternative Bloc where they are not necessarily going to be perfectly aligned to PAS. But the fact that PAS have over 50% of the seats means that they should be able to pass through their agenda, which is pro-EU, pro-Ukraine, throughout the next parliament. So that's absolutely fantastic. It really, really is. Now, this was written at the time of the election still taking place, just before results were announced. Just a few bits that I think are worth looking at. According to various reports, Russia spent over $400 million, about 1.5% of Moldova's GDP. We've heard different numbers, 400 million, 200 million, 180 million, trying to secure its desired outcome in the elections. Yet Maia Sandu's pro-European party is not only winning decisively and irreversibly, but a full third of the Transnistrian electorate cast their ballots for Sandu's party. Wow, that's the annexed pro-Russian area. A third of them cast their votes for the PAS. Wow. Right, Euromaidan Press reported that everyone expected Russian interference to swing Moldova's election. Instead, Moldova turned the tables. They mapped the networks, arrested the coordinators, froze the accounts, and watched paid voters stay at home. This is how they beat Putin's playbook, and they've written an article on that. Just going to finish off, just a quick summary. Pro-EU forces gained 55.8% of the parliament. This says parliamentary vote. I think that means seats here. In Moldova on the 28th of September, while combined pro-Russian forces scored only 30.4%, despite projections of pro-Russian victory. Moldova just showed a masterclass in beating $180 million of Russian election interference. So it depends who you listen to as to how much money you think was spent on trying to influence the election from the Russian point of view. Now, this was some interesting quotes here from Yasmina talking about what happened straight away after there were these protests that took place straight away after the elections from the pro-Russian camp, but they were really underwhelming, which is fantastic news, right? Russian propaganda began to claim that Moldovan elections were rigged. Propagandists were incredibly quick with the distribution of images of supposedly large protests. Quote, leaders and activists of the Patriotic Bloc have taken their fight to the streets, protesting outside the Election Commission headquarters in Chisinau. They accuse the Commission of gross violations during the voting process. Crowds chant, no falsification, no falsification, no falsification. A Kremlin stooge calmed the handful of protesters and called on them to return tomorrow at noon. And then you've got this quote from one of these stooges. Moldova, 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 the crowd chanted. Oh, quelle surprise, says this source. The folks who haven't held a genuinely free and fair election since, well, ever, we're talking about Russians here, are suddenly deeply concerned about democracy in Moldova. This isn't a protest. It's a press conference for the Kremlin's talking points, complete with the mandatory no to falsifications chant. It's their standard playbook. When you lose, declare the game is rigged. I mean, that's Donald Trump's MAGA for you. The only thing slipping here is a mask of the Patriotic Bloc as a legitimate political force. They're just the latest front in the Kremlin's election denial strategy. Go whine into your state TV cameras, guys. The rest of the world has seen this movie before. So this is RT reporting on, this huge protest, which happens to look more like a press conference than a protest. Diaspora to blame, says Nexter, reporting here that Dodon declares victory and files a complaint with the CEC. Now, Igor Dodon, who is one of these pro-Russian leaders, said, these elections showed the PAS once again lost inside the country. Once again, PAS relies on the diaspora. We filed documents on violations. Victory will be ours. Hooray, comrades. And of course, it won't be. and as Nexus says, and what about the fact that the diaspora votes are just as legal as the ones inside the country? So that's weird anyway. Yeah, really, actually quite a muted response from the pro-Russians. Tim White summarizes that Russia tried to organize a well-publicized protest rally against the election results in Moldova. The BBC says only a few dozen turned up, and police say many of those were paid. So really not very many people there. And then you got this guy who came in and shouted Slava Ukraini. So they love free speech so much, which of course, but when a guy shouted Slava Ukraini, he was attacked. So yeah, good stuff, Moldova. And Pekka Kalianiemi says Russia's interference in Moldova is failing spectacularly. The planned pro-Russia protest drew only about 300 people and lasted just 20 minutes. Yeah, excellent news for Moldova. It's so important for both the EU and Ukraine. Okay, we're going to move to JD Vance here, who has said that Russia has declined all proposed talks with Ukraine in recent weeks, including trilateral formats involving Trump or other US officials, said the vice president. He added that Moscow continues to avoid dialogue despite ongoing efforts from Washington to push for peace. Good to have JD Vance I guess he has to, seemingly disparaging about Russian attempts to actually sit down and negotiate with Ukraine and with the US. Now, I find this fascinating from Alexander Stubb, who's a bit of a Trump whisperer. The Finnish president has said that he believes Donald Trump is shifting from persuasion, so that appeasement will try and convince them by 2 weeks, 2 weeks, no, 2 more weeks, yeah, okay, no, how about this? Me old mate Poots, how you doing, buddy? From persuasion to pressure in his effort to end the war in Ukraine. So Stubb appears to be somewhat confident that Trump is actually going to apply pressure to Russia, and he's moving from that, he says persuasion, I'd say appeasement, to pressure. And if that is really what's going on, then that is good news, because the US, Trump, could have solved this war. He really could have solved it very quickly. Not in 24 hours, of course. That's ridiculous. But he could have solved it quickly by whacking absolutely humongous sanctions on Russia straight away, pressuring China and India, and actually doing things from a much more strategic point of view. But he didn't, because he didn't think Russia would lose. He said the other day, and quite incredible as it was, I talked about this I think yesterday, where at the speech to the commanders at Quantico, he was saying that he was disappointed in Putin. I'm so disappointed in you. You didn't win the war as quickly as I think you should have done. What? And he wasn't saying that in a like, you only say you're disappointed in someone not winning if you wanted them to win, right? So it wasn't a case of like, Russia should have won on paper. You look at that, they should have won, and how odd it was that they didn't win. How not disappointed, but what a surprise, or what a failure of Russia not to have won from their kind of organizational point of view. No, it wasn't that. It's like, what a disappointment. And he said something else at the end as well that was pretty staggering, that one of you pointed out, but I can't remember what it was. It just really, really showed that actually he does appear to be aligned to Putin in a fairly significant way there. But I do like the, well, actually, I was going to go on to, no, I think this is better next. So talking about Trump not doing enough for Ukraine straight away, the garden of forking paths, right? He took the wrong path, and he went down a path of appeasing Russia. And I think he strategically should have supported Ukraine, because he would have had the backing of his party, all but a couple of wingnuts. I mean, they weren't supporting him on Russia-Ukraine because of their own ideology of Russia-Ukraine. Most of the GOP would support Trump no matter what he did, right? And if he had come out and fully supported Ukraine, then they would have been behind him. So I think it was strategically stupid of him, because now he's been made to look like a fool because Putin has done one on him. But the reason he did that, in my opinion, one of the big reasons is because he just thought Russia was so big that it couldn't lose, and he likes to back a winner. And I was saying this a number of times recently, and then I said, do you know what? There's another analyst that said this, and that's quite nice for me because I sometimes have the imposter syndrome where I feel like I don't know what I'm talking about. And then when a proper analyst, or in this case a foreign minister, comes out and says exactly what I said, then I get this sense of validation, like, oh, thanks, mate, because sometimes I do wonder. But it's this idea, it's like, Radoslav Sikorski here from Poland said Trump loves winners. That's why he sided with Ukraine. And I really do think that. I think that he received enough intelligence and enough knowledge in going to the UK. So we know that Prince Charles, according to Daily Telegraph, referring to sources from inside Ukraine, inside the presidential aides and whatnot, I think the understanding was that King Charles III and Keir Starmer did a really good job of influencing Donald Trump when he came over. And I think that was super important. Then, of course, Trump went to the UN meeting and then met with Zelensky and gets on better with Zelensky now. Zelensky has worked out how to deal with Trump, I think, better, and received decent information. So all of that together, and I don't know how much came from US intelligence, where it should come from, but I don't know that he takes intelligence briefings anymore, particularly. You just listen to people or Fox News or what people say around him. And that's the problem with Portland the other day, where, he decided to send the National Guard into war-ravaged Portland because he had been told that there are loads of fires there and there are loads of riots. And basically he's looking at 2020 footage from the BLM riots, and then people around him talking absolute bollocks. But the point is that for Trump, there is a massive disparity between reality and his perception. And I don't think that's any more evident than with Ukraine, where his perception of the war in Ukraine has been so erroneous because he was receiving intelligence really directly from Russia, and he has all these pro-Russian simps around him, the Heritage Foundation, sort of pro-Russia, pro-Orban, pro-Hungary lot. They are just feeding him absolute bullshit. And then he goes and meets these people who actually know better, like the British and the people at the UN and Macron and Zelensky, and he's like, oh man, Russia is screwed. Their economy's done. Jeez, I've just found out how freaking terrible their economy is, and they're all queuing up for fuel, and Ukraine has absolutely hammered their hydrocarbon sector. He's backing a winner. The only reason he switched to support Ukraine in that Truth Social post is because he then suddenly understands Ukraine is more likely to win than Russia. It's nothing to do with morality, nothing to do with politics, nothing to do with geopolitics and strategies. It's like, I only back a winner, and Russia look like they're losing now, so I ain't going to back you anymore. And he came out and said, I think Ukraine can win with the help of the European Union. So he's distancing himself from the whole thing. He said, you guys get on with it. We'll sell you loads of stuff. Go for it. Bish bash bosh. Might even give you some tomahawks. Go for it. You beat Russia, because I don't think Russia are going to win this now. And here Sikorski is like, Trump loves winners. That's why he sided with Ukraine. 100% agreement there, mate. Then you have Donald Tusk here saying, the Prime Minister saying, Ukraine will win this war. We will save the independence of Ukraine. We will save the future of our generations. It's good to see certainly political support in Poland for Ukraine. There are some issues with social unease with Ukraine, some on the right in Poland, especially since there was issue with the Volyn massacre in the middle of World War II, where Ukrainians did kill a whole load of Polish people in that border area, and that's a bone of contention, historical bone of contention. But then you have people, I think, on the far right in Ukraine in Poland who do not want to support Ukraine, and that is leading parties like Confederation, the far right populist, not the PIS, which is sort of quite far right but not far right. The right-wing populist PIS is still broadly in support of Ukraine, but Confederation aren't. But there is, you can see statistically with all the surveys that there's less and less support for Ukraine from Poles. And that is a challenge. There was a guy who was set up, a 23-year-old Ukrainian I was reading about today. He was set up on a date with someone, but it wasn't real. It was all catfishing. And then a bunch of young lads beat this Ukrainian up, shaved his head, and drew a swastika on his head. And you're like, okay, that's not cool. And I'm pretty sure that's to do with the fact that that guy was Ukrainian. Anyway, there you go. But I don't know. There's probably more details to come out of that. Lukashenko threatened, so here's the dictator of Belarus, a full-scale war with Poland over its plans to shoot down Russian aerial objects. If they hit something over Kaliningrad, we'll have to fight, as they say in Russia, with all we've got. Is that what they want? I hope they calm down. So Lukashenko is threatening Poland if Poland shoots down aerial threats themselves over their own airspace or even Kaliningrad. Then he's like, we're going to start on you, mate. We're going to join in the war on behalf of Russia. I mean, that's quite incredible. Lukashenko being pretty nuts there. Right, going to move on to Hungary. And now, if you remember, what was all this about? So you had at least two drones that went in over the border area from Hungary into Ukraine, into the Zakarpattia area. And one of them went quite far into Hungary and did into Ukraine and did a sort of a route. This was then called out by both Zelensky and the Foreign Minister Andrei Sybiha. The Foreign Minister for Hungary, Peter Shiharto, then came out and said, "That's all fake news, load of rubbish. No, it didn't happen." And there was this spat between Andrei Sybiha and Peter Shiharto. Then Viktor Orban went on that sort of that video interview where he came out and said, well, even if there were 1, 2, 3, 4 drones, then anyway, you're not a sovereign country because you're completely propped up by the West and the EU. And he's like slagged off Ukraine, but then essentially admitted that there were drones. To which Andrei Sybiha now says, the good news is that the Prime Minister, Viktor Orban, admitted some drones did enter Ukrainian airspace from Hungary. Minister Shiharto, how's your tweet about fake aged poorly? In other words, you said this was fake news. Didn't age well, did it? Because your Prime Minister has completely contradicted you. So anyway, this is still an ongoing spat between the two nations, and that's not good, really. You want Hungary to be on side. Some might say that actually Shiharto, Sybiha for the Ukrainians, the foreign minister, is being a little bit too justifiably so in terms of like these guys deserve kind of the ridicule and the frustration, but this is real politique, and actually you really need Hungary on side. So as annoying as Hungary are, like this is an escalating tension between the countries that is only going to be solved if Peter Magyar gets in as the opposition leader with the ATPGEO party in the elections next year. That's a fair time away. I mean, it's getting closer and closer, and we don't know whether Orban will try and rig the elections. Anyway, now there's this tit for tat because Ukraine banned a couple of Hungarian news portals, Origo and Demokrata, because they were spouting pro-Russian propaganda. And then Ukraine, so the Hungarian government has blocked Ukrainian news portals, in response to Origo. So Origo and Demokrata were blocked by the Ukrainians, and now Hungary has blocked all of these, including Ukrainska Pravda, Hromadska, NV, quite a few like main Ukrainian websites and media entities here. And so there is a bit of tit for tat going on, and again, that's not healthy for the relationship between the two countries. Following the principle of reciprocity, Hungary is introducing mirror measures today against Ukrainian news portals, so they will not be available in Hungary. And now we're going to move on to the onto India. So Indian refiner Nayara Energy, part owned by Russia's Rosneft, is recovering from EU sanctions that froze operations 2 months ago. Running at 75% capacity on Russian crude, it's restoring exports via a floating storage near Oman while relying on rupee payments through state banks. So that's a bit of a shame that they are getting back on their feet after EU sanctions on them. Russia does take rupees and yuan for business, and that's a bit of a challenge for Russia because that means they have to spend rupees and yuan, which means they generally have to buy stuff off India and China rather than on the open market. And of course, the inability to easily use dollars as the international currency the benefit of the dollar, and this is what helps prop up the American economy, is that everyone uses a dollar because you want a universal currency. And this is why some people are trying to get cryptocurrency to be adopted, and BRICS want an alternative to the dollar. But the dollar is, what you can use and you can spend anywhere. To some degree, the same with euros and pound sterling, and I think Japanese currency as well have a degree of being able to be used internationally, but certainly the dollar there. And with Russia doing quite a bit of quite a few transactions in rupees and yuan, it does constrict them. Now, Igor Sushko here reports that, and this is one for a big old debate, isn't it? European Commission President Ursula von der Leyen, a former German defence minister herself, sure seems to think that NATO is dead. She's holding a summit on Wednesday to begin militarisation of the European Union as an institution. So there could be a big discussion going on in the EU at the moment as to whether the EU nations move away from NATO, where you've got the Americans banging a drum and saying, you've got to do this, you've got to do that, and say, screw you guys. You keep having a go at us, and Trump is so anti-alliance anyway, and is making it more and more difficult as an excuse possibly to just get out of NATO and let NATO fall apart. We need to maybe either have a contingency plan or just have a replacement to NATO, whereby a militarized European organization can do the job of NATO, and it will be perfectly aligned with Europe's strategic interests alone, rather than, okay, NATO, we're having to do this because the US wants this. And of course, you wonder what Canada, Japan, Australia, New Zealand, other countries might want to do in terms of military alliances, and the UK. Interesting one, this. I think the more the US push Europe away and say you need to stand up on your own 2 feet and spend more on defence, the more Europe would say, okay, we'll spend more on defence and we'll spend it here and we'll have our own group, thank you. We'll have our own bunch of mates because you've been an unreliable defence ally, and you've been an unreliable economic ally, and in fact you're saying things to just insult us all the time. From a political point of view, from what Donald Trump says, he always calls the EU nasty EU and this and that. It's like at some point they're going to go, right, screw you, we're going to take our ball and we're going to go home. And you tie some of these things together. So right, we know that Norway, I say we know, if I remember correctly, Norway has found a massive deposit, I think, of lithium. And now Germany has just struck lithium gold. One of the largest lithium deposits on Earth was found underground in Saxony in Germany. And this may change everything, says this particular source. European electric cars can now be truly European. No more begging China, no more Silicon Valley middlemen. Time to scale, time to build. Elon, better start learning German. So here we go. Here's what AI says. Germany has discovered one of the world's largest lithium deposits, estimated at 43 million tons of lithium carbonate equivalent, in the Altmark region of Saxony-Anhalt, which could significantly impact the electric vehicle and renewable energy markets. So this is going to upset the apple cart to some degree with Trump and geopolitical strategizing on China. And we're going to talk a little bit about Taiwan soon. But also renewables, where we are embracing renewables in the rest of the world, and the US isn't. In fact, they're stopping building wind farms that are 80% completed. In Rhode Island, for example, Trump's saying, well, I'm being lobbied by the fossil fuel industries. I hate wind, I hate solar, so screw you guys. Even though Texas produces an absolute ton of solar energy, in fact, more, I think, than their hydrocarbons, and it's a hydrocarbon state. It's just absolute insanity from there's a really very good, in fact I've got it literally open on my other screen here so I can just bring it across. That's how geeky I am. There's a really very good report that's so worth looking at, called the Ember Global Electricity Review 2025. Absolutely fascinating. Let's just have a look at this just as a sidebar now, because I've got you here, why not. 40.9% is the share of global electricity generation from low carbon sources, so that's going to include nuclear. 29%, plus 29% is the growth rate of solar generation in 2024, a 6-year high. 4% is the electricity demand growth in 2024, which was amplified by heat waves. So needed more electricity in 2024, but that was helped out by a huge growth in solar. Just some really interesting this one's, if I remember correctly, solar and wind boom pushes the world past 40% clean energy, clean electricity in 2024. So what's fascinating here is that as a percentage of the total of energy production, nuclear has gone down, right? Hydro has stayed about the same. Other renewables have gone up marginally. That would be things like tidal. Wind has gone up and solar has gone up hugely. So the total, it seems, is this, so the percentage is on the right. That's a share. And on the left, is that the amount that's actually produced. So actually, the amount of nuclear has gone down, but the amount of low carbon energy production has gone up, and that's because of the growth in solar and wind. That's how I would understand that. But anyway, it's really fascinating report looking at Africa, growing. It's quite small in Africa still, but huge growth, or like percentage wise, of renewables there, particularly obviously solar is going to be super useful. Key takeaways. Okay, let's just quickly look at the key takeaways. Clean power surpasses 40% of global electricity generation from all low carbon sources. Power sources, renewables plus nuclear, surpassed 40% of global electricity in 2024 for the first time since the 1940s. Renewable power sources added a record 858 terawatt hours of generation in 2024, 49% more than the previous record of 577 set in 2022. The record increase in renewables, coupled with a small increase in nuclear output of 69 terawatt hours, brought low carbon power to 40.9% of the mix in 2024, compared with 39.4% in 2023. Hydro remained the largest source of low carbon electricity, followed by nuclear, so 14.39%, and then wind 8.1% and solar 6.9%. So in the world, 8.1% wind and 6.9% solar, rapidly gaining ground and together overtaking hydro in 2024, while nuclear's share reached a 45-year low. Solar generation has doubled over the last 3 years to reach 2,000 terawatt hours. Solar was the largest source of new electricity generation globally for the third year in a row. I've got solar panels on my roof and I freaking love them. And the fastest growing source of electricity for the 20th year in a row. So on and so forth. Massive increases there, and it's all very interesting. Anyway, so this then has, all of this brought together has geopolitical implications, because you're going to want to be building more batteries. So the thing about solar is you generate it in the daytime, but then as Trump keeps saying, like, it's so runs hot and cold, or it's not reliable. Well, no, that's why you have batteries. So when you have solar panels put in your house, what you do is you put a massive battery in your house, so you're not really sending it back to the grid. You're storing it for the nighttime, and then when you use electricity at nighttime, you're just drawing from your battery, and then if your battery's full and you're generating, then you can sell it back to the grid. But generally you have a battery to store your fuel now. And that's the key, and that'll be the same with mass generation too. So anyway, lithium's going to be super important because you're going to want more electric cars, and then as you're going to be drawing more electricity from the grid to charge your vehicles, you're going to need more solar panels and wind, or energy as a whole. And this is a ridiculous situation in the US, is that they're stopping all of this energy stuff, rather than just saying we're going to build more gas power stations or oil fired power stations or whatever. They're literally saying we're going to stop. Like, I know you're just about to finish building a wind turbine wind farm, we're going to stop that. So, but we've got data centers and we've got electric cars and everything. We are crying out for electricity. Why would you stop that? Because I freaking hate it. I hate those bloody bearded hipsters walking around with wind turbines coming out their asses, and it's just like, oh my god, you are so stupid. It just makes no sense. Anyway, vaguely connected is the idea that the US previously saw Taiwan as an ally, because one, they didn't want China to be imperialistic, and two, they didn't want China to be imperialistic concerning a nation that was providing them with a lot of microchips and microelectronics. What Biden did that was pretty sensible is like, actually, we need national security in microelectronics, so we need to have some of that manufactured here in the US. So the Chips and Science Act put loads of funding into building electronics, microelectronics in the US. Trump's come along and said, why are we supporting Taiwan? Because actually they're producing things that we want. They're like a competitor rather than seeing us as allies, and there being a win-win situation. This is a zero-sum game. And, if they're producing microelectronics, it means we're not, so therefore they're evil. And then I'm simplifying this. So he's like, we don't need to bother to be their ally. And then, so Trump's administration is now pressuring Taiwan to shift 50% of its chip production to the US or risk losing US protection against China. So they're basically doing protection racketeering here. This is a protection racket. And if you don't pay us, if we don't move 50% of your production to my country, I'm not going to protect you anymore. And you see China that's going to beat the crap out of you, tough luck, mate. You're on your own. That's basically what Trump is saying. And it's pretty radical. Now, it turns out, as we hear today from Reuters, Taiwan has rejected that US proposal for 50% production sharing in chip production. Quote, our negotiating team has never made any commitment to a 50% production sharing agreement. Rest assured, we have not discussed this issue during this round of negotiations and will not agree to such terms. You can imagine they're not going to do that, but then the US is not going... the US is moving away from getting involved. They're going full isolationist. And even the China hawks are saying, well, we've got to concentrate on domestic issues. So they're sending the military, the US, around to Democrat cities to try and beat up hipsters and then nick brown skinned people and send them off. And meanwhile, they're blowing up civilians in boats flying around the Caribbean, Venezuelan boats. So they're worried about that sliver of the world, like North and South America. And, not least, should we... No, I don't want to sidebar on supporting Javier Milei's anarcho-capitalistic nightmare down in Argentina, where the US is now going to bail them out to the tune of, 20 billion or whatever. Even though Argentina are providing the soybeans that China are not buying off the US. So the US has not only put tariffs on to screw over their own soybean exports to China, so China now refusing to buy American soybeans and say, instead we're going to buy them from Argentina, and then the US is like, instead of going, screw you, Argentina, like Argentina's going, by the way, our economy is just collapsing, and the US goes, Javier Milei, I liked him, he had that chainsaw at the CPAC, didn't he, the Conservative Conference, we better bail them out. Yeah, but aren't they our competitors in soybean? No, we're going to and we're also going to pay loads of money to our farmers that we screwed over. It's just absolute insanity as far as I am concerned. Now I'm having this big argument with someone in the threads about whether it's an insane economic policy that the US is having. I would say overall the American economic policy is pretty insane, not least because most of the rest of the world now doesn't like the US. It's as far as soft power goes, most countries think that the Trump administration is a bag of knobs. Just there you go. Like, you've started a trade war with everyone, you put tariffs on everyone. It's just nuts. We don't really like you. So if you think that's good economic policy, well, so be it. Right, now we're going to get on to information discussions and far-right influence and all sorts. Now, there's a really fascinating article in The Guardian. The far-right Facebook groups are the engine of radicalisation in the UK, data investigation suggests. Now, this will apply, I'm sure, around the world. Fascinating piece, this. We'll look at the beginning of it. So, a network exposes hundreds of thousands of Britons to racist language. This is Facebook. Conspiracy and disinformation, according to Guardian research. A network of far-right Facebook groups is exposing hundreds of thousands of Britons to racist and extremist disinformation and has become an engine of radicalisation, a Guardian investigation suggests. Run by otherwise ordinary members of the public, many of whom are at retirement age, the group are a hotbed of hardline anti-immigration and racist language where online hate goes apparently unchecked. Now, this isn't a case necessarily of like state actors and trolls and bots, although they probably will be taking information from there and disseminating that in their groups. These are like retired people and just randos with Facebook groups that are just existing in these information silos that are havens for the far right. And, people don't wake up in the morning with kind of whole new sets of information in their heads that have just appeared there by magic. We get all of our information from different places, newspapers, TV shows, news channels, YouTube, Facebook, Twitter, Blue Sky, whatever. And we all exist in our silos. Now, I am my own little silo, and I will give you what I think is a correct interpretation of the information. But as I'm arguing to people, they think I've got a really narrow sense of what's going on in, say, the US. I'm arguing with this guy at the moment who thinks that Trump is the best at everything in the world, in every domain, and he's just absolutely wonderful, and the sun shines so far out of his arse that it makes his face orange, right? And he says, look, my understanding of X, Y, and Z is rubbish and narrow, and you just listen to the left-wing cartel of mainstream media in the United States without recognizing at all that Fox News, Newsmax, and OAN, but Fox News particularly, just far outstrips the viewership of his supposed left-wing cartel. And it's as if CNN is left-wing when it's not progressive, mate. That's, in the European sense, that's well centrist. Anyway, that aside, like, I exist in the silo, you exist in the silo, we all do. What I try and do is I give you my side of what I think's going on, and it will come with bias and baggage, but I try and back it up, right? I try and let you know why I think these things, and I'm not. We're all ideological. I think personally, I've become more centrist over the past 3 years because of the war in Ukraine. I fully understand the place that the military-industrial complex plays now in a way that I never would have done previously, and I'm happy to be centrist because I think that's moderate. But I'm socially liberal, and I don't care for otherizing marginal groups in society. That's not morally who I am. So yeah. I suppose I'm kind of economically and politically centrist over to centre left, or maybe even slightly further left when it comes to like social matters. But anyway, here, run by otherwise ordinary members of the public, many of whom are at retirement age, the groups are a hotbed of unchecked hardline anti-immigration racist language. So experts who reviewed The Guardian's months-long data project said such groups help to create an online environment that can radicalise people into taking extreme actions, such as last year's summer riots. The network is exposed just weeks after the 150,000 protesters from all over the country descended on London for a far-right protest, the scale of which dwarfed police estimates and whose size and toxicity shocked politicians. Now, I was going to show you or talk about a guy called Nico Omilana, isn't it? Nico Omilana. The Unite the Kingdom protests that took place, 150,000, however many it was. Like I said to you before, all racists would have gone on that protest, but not all protesters were racist. So there would have been quite a lot of people who were there, without particularly problematic viewpoints, I hope. But actually, there were a lot of racists. There were a lot of really, really horrible views on that. There were scuffles. There was all sorts going on. Nico Omilana is this YouTuber. My son, I was quite happy he showed me this video. I'd already seen 2 clips of it. So when he came up to me, I was like, I know this video, Matt. I've seen 2 clips and they're horrific. But he was like, he loves Nico Omilana, who's a mixed race guy, YouTuber. Was he part, not the Sidemen, the other one, was he part of the Beta group, Beta gang, or the Sidemen? I don't know, or maybe associate, whatever. So one of these young YouTubers, and he's a mixed race guy, and I think he put on a latex mask or makeup. I think it was a latex mask. And he went undercover, and he was speaking to loads of people on the Unite the Kingdom march. You have to see the video. It's quite incredible. Like, some of the insanely racist stuff that was said was just gobsmacking. And although he did a bit, not entrapment, he was leading people with the kind of what they eventually said. But it took quite a lot of balls for him to do that, because he's a person of colour right in amongst a whole load of white people who were being quite racist, and that was quite a risk. And he was talking to them, and he was pretending to be kind of racist like them and saying things. But one woman who was like, yeah, I've got a bag with knives in, and I've got these for any blacks I see, and I'm going to blah, blah, blah. I've got 3 knives in this bag, and I hate blacks, and blah blah blah. So you had that, but how representative was all of that in terms of the number of people there? But my idea is that is becoming worse and worse as the Overton window has expanded. It's more acceptable to talk in really quite, I think, dangerous rhetoric. You're seeing it all the time on places like Twitter, and we know that young people, particularly in America, have swung to the right. Young men, as they are existing in these informational silos, where they're becoming more and more kind of either hard radicalized or just soft radicalized over to this kind of place, which I think, anyway. The Guardian's data projects team identified the groups and from the profiles of those who took part in the riots that followed the killing of 3 girls in Southport last summer. From them emerged an ecosystem where mainstream politicians are described as treacherous, traitors and scum. The courts and police engage in two-tier justice, and the RNLI is a taxi service. So the Royal National Lifeboat Institute, which saves people at sea. When you get dinghies full of illegal immigrants that are sinking, they'll go and save them, and then people say you're just a taxi service for immigrants. The Guardian analysed more than 51,000 text posts from 3 of the largest public groups in the network, and they found hundreds of concerning posts that experts said were peppered with misinformation and conspiracy theories containing far-right tropes, the use of racist slurs, and evidence of white nativism. A key element of the network's success is the group's admin, a team of mostly middle-aged Facebook users responsible for the invites to the group, the moderation of often far-right language, and the spread of rumour and misinformation, which they repost to other groups in the network. Research showed that it was all across the UK, and people came from different social backgrounds, home lives, so on and so forth. Most of the admins in the Guardian contacted would not speak on record, but from her doorstep in a Leicestershire village, one who moderates 6 groups with nearly 400,000 members between them, including Nigel Farage for PM, said far-right users were deleted and blocked from the groups. However, the investigation found swathes of examples of extreme far-right posts, including disinformation and well-known debunked conspiracy narratives, some of which are spread word for word or with slight variations in writing across multiple connecting groups. Immigrants come in for the most vituperative language, including demonizing and dehumanizing slurs, criminal, parasites, primitive, lice. Muslims are variously described as barbaric and intolerant, an army, archaic, medieval, not compatible with the UK way of life, etc., etc. Okay. One post read, "We need a humongous nit comb to scrape the length and breast of the UK to get rid of all the blood-sucking lice out of our country once and for all." So that's the sort of stuff that's going on, but it's really prevalent, right? And here's an example of like Otto English is a source on Twitter that I have followed for some time. When I joined this site, he said, it was an extraordinary place full of diverse opinions and people. It was a scene of much laughter, much rage, and much debate across the 15 years that followed, but now it's an effing cesspit. Since getting taken over by Elon Musk, it has become a haven for the worst people on the planet, a shithole full of hate, disinformation, and most of all, abject effing stupidity. It's even worse than Facebook, and all of us should be embarrassed to be here. Most of all the norms. So as I post my final tweet, I beg you to leave this shithole, all of you with any sanity. Now, I necessarily have to stay here because some of the sources I need for my reporting on Ukraine only exist here for me. But I understand Twitter, and hopefully you'll see that most of my tabs here are blue sky. But I really understand that sentiment because Elon Musk changed the algorithm just the other day and said, you might have noticed I changed the algorithm. And it seemed to coincide with that I started getting an absolute ton of pro Farage and pro Elon, pro reform stuff on my feeds, just absolutely inundated with it. I was like, I am being fed this. I found that quite interesting. Now, TikTok is another one, and in the US it's now being taken over by a bunch of people aligned with MAGA. Larry Ellison, his son, Rupert Murdoch, Lachlan Murdoch, these people that are going to run TikTok in the US, I'm certain with a an algorithm that benefits the GOP and MAGA. Now, hundreds of TikTok accounts, says Jakub Janda, spread pro-Russian content supporting pro-Russian parties in the Czech parliamentary elections scheduled for next weekend. So the ANO party in Czechia is looking like they're going to sweep the elections, and they are a right-wing populist party who is not pro-Ukraine. And that's a real problem. They've got TikTok on their side by the look of it. Their reach, hundreds of thousands. Again, China-controlled platform helps Russian geopolitical goals. In Europe, Czech institutions are mustering an emergency response to protecting integrity of the general elections. Indeed, we hear that 286 TikTok accounts pushing pro-Russian agenda before the parliamentary votes are generating 5 to 9 million views weekly by boosting parties that want the Czech Republic to leave NATO and leave the EU. This is a challenge. I mean, it's such a challenge. Yeah. And then Pekka Kallianiemi here, although he said, I think it's been reinstated, he said his video on TikTok, where he talked about how Kash Patel, the guy in charge of the FBI, was paid $25,000 by a Russian propagandist, Igor Patanok, to produce deep state propaganda. That was then flagged, violated their community guidelines, and TikTok removed the video. Now, it has been reinstalled now, but you're thinking, is that a coincidence now that TikTok has been taken over by MAGA-aligned people? And then all of a sudden he has a video where one of the super MAGA guys, Kash Patel, he's talking about how he took money from Russian propagandists, and the video is taken down. Now, another example of this kind of media landscape that I think we're existing in at the moment. I've talked about Nathan Gill, the Reform UK Wales leader, who was, I say found guilty, admitted to taking bribes on behalf of Russia. He is literally a traitor, not using that as a pejorative. Well, it is. It's insulting, but it's accurate. So he is literally a traitor of the United Kingdom, taking money from an adversary to promote a Russian narrative there. Now, we saw nothing on the front pages of our newspapers here, and yet it was in the New York Times, it's in the Brussels Times, it's in German newspapers. He has been asked, Zia Yusuf was asked questions about Nathan Gill, but then said, "Oh, it's a nascent party. I've never met him. He's a nobody." It's like, hang on, he was the leader of the entire party in the country of Wales. Like, what do you mean he was a nobody? Farage is on record saying as a decent and honourable man, and they've been pictured together many times. Blah blah blah. So nothing on any front pages about Reform leader taking Russian bribes for which he is likely to do jail time for, says this source. But we do get Keir Starmer bought a field so his parents could rescue donkeys, and he didn't avoid any tax. So there's this old, already debunked story about Keir Starmer buying a field and then the field gets sold, but he bought it at market value, it's sold at market value. It's a nothing burger, right? But, you know, Labour had their conference, so this story was kind of front page news again, and he was getting asked about it again. Bridget Phillipson, who's a cabinet minister, her mum bought her council house and sold it 33 years later. Wow, that's a story. So you're having all these like stories being thrown around about these Labour politicians, and you're like, hang on, who's doing serious reporting on one of our major politicians for the opposition party taking bribes from freaking Russia? Why is that not front page news on the Daily Mail, the Daily Express, the Daily Telegraph, the Sun? Oh, it's because they are all completely aligned to Reform. Reform UK are the darlings of all those newspapers, and they are suppressing the news of Nathan Gill. It should be a massive, massive scandal. Anyway, Mehdi Hassan pretty much nails it here. So he said, the problem we have is that for years, the right, GOP, members of Congress, right-wing media, online influencers, combined with ruthless efficiency to weaponize every random story about cancel culture on campus, microaggressions, and create moral panics and outrages over trivial things. Oh, transgender toilets. Oh my God, yeah, men playing in women's sports teams and all this stuff that's essentially irrelevant and should be sorted out down here without anyone. You don't vote for a party on the basis of that, apart from you do, because if you scare people with war on Christmas, you can't say Merry Christmas. It's illegal to say Merry Christmas. You get shot in the face. Santa will come down and shoot you in the face. Oh no, Jesus will come down and shoot you. You know, shut up, man. This is just what you're doing. Is you're being sold absolute distractions over here by people who want to do terrible things over here. So we've got some horrible economic and welfare policies that you'll absolutely hate, but we can't campaign on that because you will never elect us. So we're going to campaign on transgender toilets. Mehdi Hasan nails it. Problem we have is that for years the right, GOP members of Congress, right-wing media, online influencers combined with ruthless efficiency to weaponize every random story about cancel culture on campus, microaggressions, and create moral panics and outrages over trivial things. There is no equivalent on the liberal left that can do the same for much, much bigger and more serious free speech violations and authoritarian actions like this, and we'll talk about this in a second. There's a complete imbalance in the information environment. So people hear about Mr. Potato Head, like a whole gender controversy with that Fox News was banging on about forever, but not government agents shooting at journalists. So here we have an ICE agent shooting directly into a car of a journalist today with kind of pepper bullets, I presume. Absolutely unprovoked. My window was open and chemicals went all over my face, been puking for 2 hours. There was not one protester in sight. I was simply driving by to check the scene out, like I have been for weeks, about 50 feet from the entrance. Local authorities, along with my news organisation, are taking this very seriously. More to come. Journalist shot through the window of their car. Then we have another one. This is from CBS Chicago reporter. I don't know the name there because it's just a handle. This morning, who was simply doing her job. It comes one day after journalist Steve Held was detained and then released. So you're arresting journalists, you're sending troops around to all these different cities, but do you know what? Transgender toilets. This is what you're getting now. You're getting an attack on the First Amendment principles. You're getting, I would say, a massive authoritarian move here in the United States. But people voted. Remember that transgender advert that got everyone really heated just before the election? And it had all those millions of impressions, and apparently it was what shifted the needle for a bunch of people. You're like, yeah, that's what they did. And you do it so, and he's right, they do it so well. The right do it so well. They just campaign so much more cleverly. They don't do geeky policy. They do emotional heart stuff that gets people enraged. Fear sells. Anyway, that's pretty much enough from me. I've played you some of this before, but you keep hearing me rant about Nigel Farage. I'm not a fan, obviously. He's completely not my cup of tea. But just in case you kind of like him for these reasons, just remember what he has said about EU and NATO expansionism being responsible for the war in Ukraine, calling it the Ukraine, and just basically sucking up to Putin.
And the moral of the story is, if you poke the Russian bear with a stick, don't be surprised when he reacts. We ourselves in the European Union provoked the conflict through our territorial expansionism in the Ukraine. We poked the Russian bear with a stick, and unsurprisingly, Putin reacted.
I was asked a couple of months ago which world leader did I admire, and I said Vladimir Putin as an operator, particularly the way he managed to stop the West getting militarily involved in Syria.
And I don't admire Putin. What I said was he'd outwitted and outclassed you all over Syria. I also said I didn't like him as a human being, and I wouldn't want to live in Russia. But what I want us to do, let's not meddle. Let's not meddle.
Hang on, just before you go on, you did actually say you admired him.
As an operator, not as a human being.
The question was, which current world leader do you most admire? As an operator, I would say Putin.
Yes.
You can like or dislike Vladimir Putin, and I wouldn't want to take him to see my mum for tea on a Sunday afternoon, I've got to tell you. But he is a very canny, very sharp, very clever political operator.
The way he says that kind of stuff is admiring, right? And I could say that, he's very clever, Putin, in the way he does manipulate all these world leaders and get what he wants. But I'll be catching that but he's a complete bastard, and he's a genocidal, megalomaniacal, narcissistic dictator whom I completely despise. You never quite hear that from him. He's like, I wouldn't take him home to meet my gran for a cup of tea. But I admire him and the way he does this and the way he does that. And it's kind of similar to how he lays this out here. So he's just about to talk about expansionism right? EU, NATO expansionism. But he says the Russian population think this, and Putin has, really used what the Russian population think. So you say, he's couching this, and okay, so it's not that he thinks that it's NATO expansionism, but actually it's the perception from the Russians is there's NATO expansionism, and that what explains all of this, right? Okay, that's an interesting nuance, and you can get taken in by that, but then at the end he goes, yeah, and it was our fault that honestly, and then he just undoes it all by saying, yeah, it was our fault that Putin invaded. Just check this out.
Expansion of both NATO and the European Union has been seen by many Russians to be provocative, to be encircling, and Putin has managed to use that to mobilize Russian opinion to say, hey, these guys are threatening us. Yeah. They're threatening Russian-speaking people in other countries. So, yes, we've got a lot wrong, and we did start much of this.
And then he says, and yes, we got a lot wrong, and we did start a lot of this. We started a lot of this war. You know, the war where Putin invaded in 2014 and invaded in 2020. We started a lot of that. That was us that started that. Yeah, no, it wasn't.
Constant desire to expand the European Union and NATO right up to the borders of Russia, something, by the way, that George Osborne and David Cameron were the biggest cheerleaders for, has been a geopolitical error. Because if you poke Russian bears with sticks, guess what happens?
Sure.
They actually snarl and bite back.
So, I don't like him. Don't vote for him. If you like Ukraine, don't vote for him. You get the party in the UK that is most aligned to Russia. Vote Conservative rather than him. Or anyone else apart from him. Literally anyone else apart from him. Please. And I will continue to bang that drum because I think he's a snake oil salesman who will burn down the NHS, will destroy our welfare state, will rip up the rule book, will pull down our institutions and start again in true MAGA way, because that's what MAGA's doing, and he is MAGA 2.0. Do not be sucked in by just being hell-bent on sorting out immigration. There are other parties, the Tories will be going on that hard, right? At least the Conservative Party, at least depending on how
and the moral of the story
direction they're going to go in. But if they don't just try and be reform, then they'll at least be a little bit more sensible with the institutions of the United Kingdom. But not a fan. Take care. Speak soon. Toodle pips.